Hi folks, I'm Zach Moss with the Isaac Walton League of America's Save Our Streams program. I'm the SOS coordinator for Iowa and some of the surrounding Midwest states. And what Save Our Streams is a volunteer water quality monitoring program. And so I help coordinate that and train people on how to do this volunteer water quality monitoring. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit today about why that's important and what we monitor for and what kind of might affect the results that we're finding. Restoration work and things like that in the field to improve water quality is important, but you don't know that you need to improve water quality in an area until you start monitoring and knowing what's actually in the water. And so the Isaac Walton League of America thinks that it's really important to be monitoring and trying to figure out how good or bad fish habitat might be, or how healthy or unhealthy the water is that you are paddling in or swimming in or drinking. So the reason that we do that with volunteers is government agencies and other organizations can't monitor every water body all the time. So for instance, the DNR's most recent monitoring report that they put out, they were only able to monitor a little bit over half of Iowa's rivers, lakes, streams, and reservoirs. And of the water bodies that they did monitor, only 23% of those actually met all water quality standards. So you don't know what you don't know is what we like to say, and even when we are getting out there and monitoring, we're not finding very good results. So there's a lot of work to do with water quality in our state, and a lot of it starts with education and just letting people know what's going on in our waterways and building a sense of caring for that waterway. What we do is we monitor for both macroinvertebrates, which are basically aquatic bugs, really small organisms that live in the streams, as a reflection of larger biodiversity in the aquatic ecosystem. We also monitor for some chemical parameters. We do 7 parameters: transparency, phosphate, dissolved oxygen, pH, nitrate, nitrite, and chloride and temperature. So the reason we focus on those parameters is because they all have an impact on aquatic life and the health of the aquatic ecosystem. So for example, transparency is one that we've probably all seen in our Iowa streams and rivers. After it rains and the water turns cloudy, that'll affect the transparency. And that's because we have things on the landscape like soil that might be eroding and washing into the water, affecting the transparency, making the water cloudier and darker. And that can affect aquatic organisms because as the water gets darker, it absorbs more sunlight and gets warmer. So there can only be a certain temperature range that different aquatic organisms can survive in. So when it gets cloudier and warmer, that's not great for those aquatic organisms. Additionally, if there's a bunch of suspended particles that can clog aquatic organisms' gills, which clearly isn't good if they're trying to breathe through those gills. So having too much stuff suspended in the water is not great for these organisms. That's why we usually, when we picture clean water, we usually picture a clear, running stream or lake where you can see the bottom. So that segues into temperature. We monitor temperature with a thermometer. It's not a very new concept for most people, but certain organisms can only live in a certain range of temperature. And so, for instance, trout really need really cold water, but a leech or a more tolerant organism can survive in pretty warm, muggy water in the summertime. And so we can monitor for temperature and get an idea of how warm or cool the water is, which can then, of course, reflect into what kind of habitat that's providing for the organisms that live there. Additionally, temperature can give us an idea of the capacity of the water to hold dissolved oxygen that these organisms rely on. So cold water can hold a higher concentration of dissolved oxygen, whereas warm water can hold less dissolved oxygen. Another reason that we monitor for temperature is oftentimes in larger cities or more developed areas, there will be a lot of what we call impermeable surfaces, such as concrete, parking lots, sidewalks, roofs, things like that basically just stop the water from entering the soil. And generally, we've all seen a road that's being flash flooded when it rains really hard, and things like that. So you can see where the water wants to soak into the soil, it's not able to, and gets rushed straight into a storm drain. If that's happening if it's raining on pavement or other surfaces that are warm, that's going to then warm the water, of course, when it hits those surfaces. So the water will be entering the stream or the river from the storm drain warmer than the rest of the stream, and so that's going to affect the temperature of the stream and impact aquatic organisms. And then we, of course, monitor for dissolved oxygen as well. And that's just a measure of how much oxygen is available within the water for these organisms to breathe and survive. So just like we need oxygen in the air, fish and aquatic macroinvertebrates and other organisms need oxygen in the water to be able to breathe and transport oxygen throughout their body. And so when we measure dissolved oxygen, we generally want to find higher results. That means that more oxygen is available for these organisms. Different kinds of organisms can survive there, and they're going to be thriving better. And so dissolved oxygen can be impacted, especially when there are a lot of organisms in the water consuming that dissolved oxygen. So we see that really frequently, or most evidently, with harmful algae blooms. And that happens when there's excessive nutrients on the landscape, which then wind up in the water. And generally these nutrients are like fertilizers that are used on lawns and golf courses and farm fields, and they're meant to help these plants grow. Then when they get in the water, they do that really efficiently in the water, and they help the algae grow and they bloom out of control. And then the issue arises when that algae then breaks down, and the bacteria that are consuming the dead algae suck a lot of the oxygen out of the water, which can lead to fish kills. The reason, again, that the fish kills happen are because there's a dramatic drop in dissolved oxygen levels, and so the fish don't have enough oxygen to breathe, and they die off in mass quantities. And so sometimes you might see a bunch of dead fish washed up on the shore of a river, or creek, or of a lake, and that's generally because the dissolved oxygen dropped really quickly. Moving on to nitrates and phosphates. Those are the parameters that we're most commonly talking about when people refer to nutrient pollution. Nitrate and phosphate are main ingredients in fertilizer applied to fields, lawns, and golf courses and other things like that, and gardens. And so generally we want to keep these nutrients on the land. They're essential to the ecosystems and essential to the plant's health. But when they're applied at the wrong time or in too high of quantities, they can wind up in our waterways, either through runoff into our surface waters like lakes and rivers, or oftentimes like nitrate can seep straight down into groundwater. But also nitrate especially has been linked with high rates of cancer, different kinds of cancer, and so if that winds up in your drinking water, that's not going to be very good for you. We do have water quality standards for drinking water, which limit nitrate to 10 parts per million in your drinking water. However, there are a lot of private wells that maybe aren't able to be tested and aren't able to meet that requirement. And so trying to keep the nitrate on the ground and in the plants in the first place is the best solution to try to keep it out of these drinking water supplies. And then phosphate is a little bit different than nitrate. It generally is also a part of fertilizer. But phosphate particles will actually bind to soil particles, so they'll kind of stick together on the ground. And then it'll stay there even when it rains, unless the soil is washed into the water. So the soil will carry the phosphate with it into the water if it's being eroded into the waterway. So that kind of relates the transparency that we monitor for and the phosphate measurement as well. So phosphate's also commonly found in manure and sewage and other fecal matter. And so if you're finding really high phosphate, that could potentially indicate that there's a manure spill or a sewage leak or something upstream of you, and might be worth investigating to try to figure out what's going on that's causing these high levels, and try to remedy that. We also monitor for chloride, which is generally the way that we think about it is it's the main ingredient in salt. So road salt that's applied during the wintertime, as well as other ice melt products like magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, they all have chloride in them. And so if you're finding really high chloride spikes, especially in the wintertime, that's likely linked to the ice melt products being applied either at the wrong time or at too high of application rates. And it does a really good job of melting the snow, what it's intended to do. But when it's applied in too high quantities, that snow melts and it carries all this excess chloride with it into the storm drains. Those storm drains then empty directly into a nearby waterway. Some people don't realize that storm drains actually aren't treated in most places around the country like our water is that we flush down the toilet or that goes down our sink drains. So whatever goes down these stormwater drains will go directly into a local waterway. Our last parameter that we measure is pH, and pH is just a measure of how acidic or how basic the water is. So you might be familiar with the concept of acidity in like lemons or battery acid or something like that, or bleach. One that's actually happened twice this year here in Iowa is that milk ended up being spilled into a waterway. And so when the milk gets in the waterway, it alters the pH, and that's not going to be great for aquatic organisms that need a really specific range. pH ranges from 0 to 14, 0 being really acidic, 14 being really basic. Normally we want water to be right at a 7, which is what we call neutral. 6 to 8 maybe might be tolerable, but once you start getting outside of that range, it's going to really start affecting aquatic organisms. With all these different parameters, you can expect to find different kinds of results depending on when you're monitoring. Sometimes it'll fluctuate with seasonality, and then sometimes the reason that fluctuates is because of our natural conditions, and sometimes it fluctuates because of human activities during those seasons. So just starting in spring, spring is in Iowa a lot of times when fertilizer is being applied to fields, things like that to get ready for the planting season. And there might also be tillage going on, churning out the soil, exposing it to potential erosion. And also in spring is when we get our heaviest rains. So you've kind of got a recipe for disaster there with sedimentation and erosion and nutrient pollution. You're also going to be finding higher flows during the springtime, usually from the snow melting off and the spring rains. And when we measure chemical parameters, we're measuring concentration. So we're looking at parts per million or milligrams per liter. And so it could be the case that the concentration might not change that much, but you're still moving a high quantity or a high volume of pollutants down the stream. So you get more water in the stream and more pollutants at the same time, it's still going to show about the same concentration, but you're going to have still a large volume of pollutants being moved through the stream. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're monitoring during a high flow period. During the summertime, when it gets warmer and the nutrients are in the water, that's going to be really your prime time for these algae blooms with all that extra sunlight and providing everything that these algae organisms need to bloom in the waterways. So that's going to then lead to, you can expect to find decreased oxygen levels in the summertime. When there's less water and it's warmer, it holds less oxygen, especially during the summertime when the organic matter is being broken down, consuming the oxygen out of the water. So that's a really stressful time for aquatic organisms usually. And so during summertime when it's dry and rainwater isn't washing pollutants into your local waterways, if there are still pollutants being applied to the land, they're just going to build in concentration. And so then next time it does rain, you could see a huge spike in these pollutants. And so you might be seeing really good levels of pollutants during the summertime. Really, what desirable levels is healthy. But if you monitor right after a rainstorm and you're seeing these high pollutant levels, then that can kind of give you an idea of what's happening in the watershed. Then you move into the fall. Usually it starts getting cooler. Usually the water's a little clearer. And sometimes in the fall you'll see fall manure application to farm fields especially. And so if that winds up being applied before a rain event or something like that, it can wind up in a waterway. Or if there's a spill or something like that and that manure ends up in a waterway, you can expect to find high phosphate results because of that. And then in the wintertime, we don't usually think, a lot of people don't think about water quality in the wintertime when the water ices over, but the same basic watershed principles apply, that what happens on the land happens to the water. So the biggest activity during the wintertime that we are concerned about is chloride pollution. But any other pollutant that's spilled or that's applied to the land is still going to wind up in the water. It might even be stuck in one spot, frozen until spring melt, but we still need to be conscious of what's going on the land. Yeah, so those 7 parameters that we measure for, they're super simple. They all have the instructions printed directly on the kits themselves, and it takes less than 15 minutes to do all these tests and get some really beneficial data about what's happening in the waterway at that point in time. So that's why we really like these chemical monitoring parameters.